All right. Well, thank you very much, folks, for joining us for our second event in honor of Black History Month. My name is Craig Nakashian, and I am the department chair of the Department of History and Political Science here at Texas A&M University, Texarkana. And I'm very excited to be able to bring this discussion to you today. Our discussion today is about the historic Jamison Building in downtown Texarkana. This talk is sponsored by the Red River Center for Regional History and Culture and the President's Committee on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So I'm going to introduce our three speakers, then I'll be quiet and let them go ahead and present, and then we should have some time for discussion at the end. If you want to submit a question via the chat while the conversation is going on, that's fine, or you can wait until the end and we can unmute and do it that way. So our first speaker is Jamie Crawley. You should be able to see him at the top of the screen. There he is. Jamie is an architect with Texas Main Street and a design lead at the Texas Historical Commission. We also have Ina McDowell, who on my screen is right next to him. Ina is the executive director of Main Street Texarkana. And we also have Ms. Cylestine Thornton, who is a lifelong resident of Texarkana, Arkansas, had taught for about 40 years at Texarkana, Arkansas School District, and is the property manager of the Jamison Building. So I will go ahead and mute myself and be quiet and turn it over, I think, to Jamie, who's going to be talking first. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. Hello to everybody in our virtual setting here. So yeah, I'm with the Texas Historical Commission. I'm a licensed architect, and I'm design lead with our Texas Main Street program. So we're the state portion of that. Ina is your local Texarkana Main Street manager, and so I was fortunate to go out and visit almost just pre-pandemic, and the real big reason to come out was actually to see this building. And so for the past year or so, we've been working with the family, and you're going to hear from Cylestine in a moment, who and sort of a little bit more about the story of this building. But for context, both architectural and as well as historical, and some of the process that historic preservation architects like myself deal with properties like this, I want to kind of give a little bit of a tie into how Texarkana and why this particular building that you're seeing on the screen, which is the Jamison Building, is so important. So first off, and I'm going to run through about 10 slides. I'm going to do it very quickly. So if somebody has questions about them specifically, that we can certainly come back to it. But I think it sets a framework and a context for everybody. So you see this kind of aerial view map of Texarkana on the left, with the title "Lost Black Heritage Sites." So there's several kind of Google pins for particular properties of note that historically are just not there anymore. And what I mean by not there is, if you see in the upper the upper right-hand portion of the screen, you see kind of your typical Google aerial, and then on the right of that, an arrow pointing to a building on another map. And what that is it's a Sanborn insurance map. So it looks like a hand-drawn map. It is a hand-drawn map. Sanborn insurance maps were developed in the 1800s to the mid-1900s. And they were basically to determine fire insurance qualities for buildings and liability in urbanized areas all across the US. Today, as historic preservationists, we use them to kind of help us understand the history of a particular property and how it's changed over time. And so these maps were issued every couple years for a particular urbanized area, and you could actually see the properties change. And you're going to see a few more of them here in a moment. But they have very interesting labels. There's color codings. There's little symbology in them that give us clues about the makeup of the building, both the actual materials themselves, how many stories, what the use was, and if they have particular titles. And clearly, I also want to show where the Jamison is located, and it was dedicated in 1930. So just kind of keep some of that in mind. We're going to come back to it again. But here's another one of those properties that was identified on the map. The areas in red are the footprints for the two buildings that you see on the right that are shown on the insurance map. So that's where those buildings were. Another church that is no longer there. Here's another one. So the intersection of Walnut and 10th, the Miles Chapel, and And that site there shown in red. And if you have good resolution on your screen, you can almost see the actual the foundation in that grassy area right at the corner. Here's a good one, Dunbar High School. This was, as you can see on the Sanborn insurance map, it's labeled as the colored high school. And what's shown on the Google aerial is you can literally see the prints of where those buildings are, their arrangement with the Sanborn insurance map. So as you're sort of seeing this pattern is all of these properties that were essentially Black heritage sites, in Texarkana proper, really relatively close to downtown or on the perimeters of downtown, are no longer there. Here's another one. This St. Pauls CME Church, again, 10th and Wood Street, and sort of that area where the park is adjacent, the shed building, that building is no longer there as well. And then Mount Zion Baptist, this one, the area that's sort of paved there would have been where the actual Baptist church was located. And so again, another property that you can see with these fire insurance maps. And I'm not necessarily showing the dates to kind of confuse folks with when these events occurred, but and each of them had different, some of these properties, these parishes, would move to other locations. There's lots of different instances, but the built history, which is really what's important from a preservation and architectural angle, the built history is no longer there. And when something's not there anymore, you can't see it, and you can't talk about it, and you can't tell its story properly. And that's really what we're going to be hearing about today. So here's a little bit larger map. These maps are quite large. They have indexes, and they come in, they all have sort of a very, very similar format. In the upper left-hand portion of the screen, you see the future site of the Jamison Building. At that point, there's actually a residence on the property. So that's the current corner of 3rd and Oak Street. The other box that's shown there is an interesting property that sort of came out of this sort of study as well, and it's the Connors Hotel. So this map that you're seeing is from 1920. So this is 10 years prior to the Jamison Building being dedicated. And then you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, the furniture store that faces Broad Street. It's still there. And what's interesting about it, if you look at the insurance map, it's a conglomeration of several different buildings that have been joined together and eventually became a furniture building much later in life. Effectively around the Jamison, that's when this building they pushed through walls and sort of joined the building together. But the Connor Hotel is still there. When you actually look at this from an aerial view, I didn't include the Google aerial on this one in particular, you actually can see that the party walls for each of these individual buildings that are shown on the Sanborn insurance map are still there. So there is historic remnants of this actual building, but you can see from the street view, it's been covered up. It's been slip covered. So you can't actually see what that historic, and you can't really tell the story of this particular site. So in that kind of architectural context, we have the Jamison Building, and you're going to hear a lot more about the family, the building, the architecture, get some looks inside here in a moment from Cylestine and Ina from a Texarkana perspective, and the family's perspective for that matter. But what's interesting, at least from a historical point of view, as we sort of have seen these lost heritage sites, and we still have the Jamison Building, is I'd like to put it in another context, is that as you're kind of reading on the screen, the architecture firm that was hired for this particular project was effectively the most, in layman's terms, they were the most famous architects in town. And they were a very, very prominent regional practice in Texarkana, Witt, Siebert, and Halsey. They actually have 12 buildings listed on the National Register of Historic Places. 2 of those are pictured here on the left and right in a timeline that are both in Texarkana. So the Texarkana City Hall, done by the same architecture firm in 1924, and then the U.S. Post Office and Courthouse afterwards. But right in between is the Jamison Building, also designed by the same architecture firm. It is not on the National Register of Historic Places, which we, my colleagues and lots of folks that we've been talking to see that as an oversight. And so there is efforts right now to rectify that and get it on the National Register of Historic Places. Currently, the property is a registered Texas historic landmark. So if you see the plaque in some of the photos, that's what that is. But that's not a National Register designation. So with that, kind of as sort of a framework and context of this building, and that is still, still exists, and I want to kind of turn it over to Ina and Cylestine to talk a little bit more about who Mr. Jamison was and sort of why this building is really important, kind of in Texarkana, and what we're hoping to see happen with it.
Okay, can you hear me?
Take it off mute.
Okay, well, I'm sorry. I guess I didn't really want to be on video today anyway. But let me tell you a little bit about the history of the Jamison Building and the Jamison family as I know it. Dr. G.U. Jamison Sr. was born in Smithville, Mississippi to Uriah and Cecilia Jamison in 1881. He was one of 11 children. He entered Mississippi State Normal School for his undergraduate degree. He went on to get his formal academic degree from the school that he entered in order to get his medical degree, or is to enter medical school. He passed the exam with a lot of hard work because he did not receive really a good education. So he studied really, really hard in order to get into the Institute of Surgery in Chicago, where he became a certified surgeon. After graduating from high school, he moved to Clarksville, Texas, where he set up his medical practice. He may have even taught school there, somewhere is in writing. He met and married his wife, Mamie Bagby. They had 2 children, Garland Uriah Jamison Jr., who became a doctor, and Mamie McIver, who became a teacher. Dr. Jamison's first office was located after moving from Mississippi in Clarksville. He moved to Clarksville, where he set up practice in 1906. Shortly setting up his practice, he moved to Texarkana, where he met a Mr. James Toll, and they set up the first Black-owned medical clinic and pharmacy in the 200 block of Main Street, which is next door to the Perot Theater, where Pecan Point is presently. To provide a broader medical service to the people, Dr. Jamison Sr. eventually opened Jamison Hospital in 1917 at 610 Hazel Street. He had many professionals working by his side in order to provide complete care. So he had technicians, he had nurses. Patients received full service at the hospital. He was the only Afro-American Black doctor between Little Rock and Dallas, Texas. The hospital also provided nurses certification. It was estimated that 3,000 operations were performed there. The hospital had 16 beds, and of course, many babies were born there. Dr. Jamison spent a lot of time at the hospital working, but during this time, we all know that he also spent a lot of time on the road, going out to see patients who could not come to the hospital. Over the years, of course, as time passed, the hospital became as not of much use, and so therefore it downsized to Jamison Clinic. It provided services in the community until 1980. Dr. Jamison Jr. had his practice in the building when it closed. After about 12 years in practice, Dr. Jamison Sr. decided that he wanted to provide more to the Black community. He thought he would build a professional building with many units to provide places for people to come set up business to provide service to the community. This would allow people of different skills to be under one roof. During these times of segregation, it was not easy to receive the needed and necessary services. But this was a place where Blacks could come to feel comfortable as they went about their business, taking care of necessary businesses and going to see the doctor. So what did he do? He got with a Dr. W.T. Thompson, a physician. He got with a Mr. A.W. Weatherford, who was a funeral director, and they united to form the partnership in order to build the building. In 1929, the construction was underway. It was built on the corner of West 3rd and Oak Street, as Jamie has shown you. The building was constructed at a cost of $60,000. I wonder where they got the loan for that building. Not really sure. But anyway, perhaps these were successful enough men that they had the resources. I don't know that. The building was an Art Deco style design. It was 2 stories. It sat on 2 lots. It equaled 12,000 square feet. The building, of course, was the first Black business and professional office in Texarkana. There were in that area, as Jamie has shown you, other businesses, churches, schools, and homes in the area. This particular place was a prominent architectural firm built the building. The contractors who built the building were all Black except for electricians, and that is because you could not find any certified electricians at the time. So when the building opened in 1930, it was a grand occasion. The streets were blocked off, orchestras played, there was a grand celebration, speeches from Black dignitaries of the day, and then the building was opened. It served American Afro businesses and cultural interests at the time. It provided a place for business to provide service to the community. The first floor had 6 office spaces. There was a pool hall, barbershop, restaurant, dry cleaners, pharmacy. The pharmacy sold ice cream, which was an attraction for many. Wiley Strickland was a jewelry store owner, and he was in the Jamison Building the longest, a mere 50 years. The second floor of this red and cream Art Deco style pattern building was reserved for the professionals. There were 5 suites and 5 separate offices. There were dentists. At one point, there were 3 dentists, 3 doctors, 2 notaries, 2 insurance agents, realtors, county agents. A newspaper even published a paper there. There was an auditorium with 2 sections of sliding doors that could open up to seat as many as 200. The building gained worldwide attention as it held dances for adults and students from the various schools. In 1937, the first few books collected for the public library for Negroes was housed at the Jamison Building. It was called the Colored Library. Then comes the Great Depression, which began in 1929, the same year that the building was being built. The 2 co-partners had to pull out for financial reasons, and Dr. Jamison was the sole barrier of the function of the building. As he passed away in 1951, his son came along to take ownership and operations of the business. It was eventually closed in about 2015 when the last tenant moved out. This building has been recognized as a Texas landmark in 1983 under the efforts of the Black Chamber of Commerce. And just as a side note, the roof on the building was completely put on, a new roof was put on in 2010. I went up the other evening to see if there were any water damages after the snow. And there was about a cup of water from the skylights, which are the original skylights, in a container that I had set underneath where a leak had been previously. Dr. Jamison had a school named after him. It's now the Texas Health Center, and it was located on 15th and Spruce Street. This building has undergone an asbestos assessment, and there was very little asbestos found. And that is the history. And just as another side note, the family, Dr. G.U. Jamison Sr. raised his family at 1015 Wood Street. That house is still at 1015 Wood Street. Thank you.
Thank you. Nope, you're muted, Ina.
Hello. Trying to be so quiet. But thank you, Cylestine and Jamie. From the standpoint of our local Main Street program, this really is an exciting project. I have felt very fortunate to be able to work with Main Street, Texas. Most recently, there were 2 Texas scholars that were assigned to this project, and they did a wonderful job and presentation of research that they did on this building. But over the last several months, it's really been an honor to work directly with the family, as well as Jamie with Main Street, Texas. I did want to say that I know a lot of you, and of course have had many years in our downtown, working with the museum system. And over that time, this building was always just such a wonderful treasure in our downtown. As a part of the museum system, it was always noted as one that definitely needed to be preserved, that people needed to know the story of this tremendous building. And just the fact that, as Jamie has pointed out, there are so few landmarks that are left that represent the African-American community in Texarkana. And so there again, showing the importance, the tremendous importance of this building. Over the years, the museum system has worked to preserve African-American history, and it's very limited resources. And so this building, though, is something that visibly we can all see, that tells a tremendous history of early professionals in our downtown. So I'm really excited about the progress with this project, and just the realization of what a wonderful presence it is in our downtown. And as Jamie's going to talk a little bit more about just the future of what it can mean for the building, but also for our downtown community.
Yeah, thank you, Ina, and thank you, Celestine. That history, every time I hear it, is pretty remarkable. And just for those who are also attending today, one of the things that Ina mentioned was that we had 2 preservation scholars, and it's sort of a unique program that we have with the Texas Historical Commission, and through our Friends organization. They have recognized that a lot of preservation efforts in the United States, and more specifically in Texas, doesn't address sort of underserved communities. And so one of the things that they've done is a very conscious effort of trying to reach out to scholars at universities who wouldn't necessarily consider themselves able to access preservation or knowledge of preservation, to really diversify and create a kind of an equitable model for more scholarship. And so we were fortunate at Main Street to have 2 people during this virtual pandemic Zoom world where we're still trying to do research. And one of the things that they really focused on was oral histories. And Cylestine was very, very gracious in spending a lot of time with them. And we were able to record a lot of those. So they did effectively an oral history project and interviewed about a dozen people from Texarkana that had some memory of this time period or the Jamison Building, as well as just sort of the city in general. And I think that those voices are really, really important. And they're that contribution is really important to the work that's being done now for the National Register nomination for the property. Ina's, sees this image. Cylestine reminded me of it yesterday, so I wanted to include it. But there's a Texarkana Main Street has a wonderful little program for Christmas ornaments, and so the Jamison Building was the Christmas ornament this year, and I think it turned out pretty wonderful. But what I'm going to just touch on really quickly is some preservation recommendations that we have kind of come out of this initial study that myself as an architect, we have an economic development specialist within Texas Main Street. We serve about 88 communities across the state that apply to be in our program. And we provide nonprofit or pro bono, design services, preservation consulting, and some economic vitality assistance to those programs. And then, as I said before, Ina is the manager for Texarkana's, and she's sort of in a unique position because of your uniqueness as a city that's straddles the state line. So she's the Main Street manager both in the Texas side as well as the Arkansas side. But specific to the building here, you see what we do as an architect and sort of our design team is we look at aspects of the building. As Cylestine said, the brick pattern itself was really unique. And if you can now, all of you have seen the pictures of this building several times, and you'll see a few more in a moment. But one of the things that's sort of really indicative of both its presence on the street, and a lot of people in the oral histories kind of mentioned the same thing, is that brick pattern is really evocative of the style and presence of this building in the community. And that's important. Design's important. One of the things that we sort of noticed as well is, yes, it's an Art Deco or Art Moderne, which is sort of the Americanized version of it. But what you see is that you've seen some light fixtures in an earlier slide, and those fixtures that now people really equate to an Art Deco period, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s in the U.S. And they are they're still present in the building, and then you saw on the upper floor all the woodwork, all that's original. You'll see here in a moment, that there's the wood floors on the second floor. The structural system of the building is actually really in pretty good shape. And as Cylestine mentioned, the roof work repairs and work that they did there really has effectively preserved a lot of the interiors of this building. You see some interesting office arrangements here. It's a sort of a double loaded corridor up on the upper floor. You have professional offices on either side. You see the transom windows above the doors to bounce some light in and carry air through the property. But you had sort of in one portion, you would have sort of an ante room. So there would be the secretary or kind of office portion, the file, and then you'd maybe have the doctor's office or the doctor's suite, the examination room in the next room. There's also the unique room that Cylestine mentioned, and then you saw an earlier image of, and then it's mentioned in some of the brochures as well that there was an auditorium and that space remains. You see it here, and effectively these bifold doors would connect 3 rooms on the second floor so that they could have events. And from the paperwork that sort of dates from that period, there were quite a number of events, and a lot of the folks that we heard from in the oral histories also kind of recalled that. So it really became, I think the story that we like to think of it as is it became its own mini Main Street for the Black community in Texarkana. And tying it back to what you saw before about all these heritage sites that are no longer there, physically no longer there. It really becomes important that this building really finds a new life. That's the most sustainable building that you have is the one that's already built. So when people talk about green building or sustainability, the one that already exists is the greenest and most sustainable thing that you can do. And it really talks about resilience in terms of construction, but also resilience in terms of community. So there it is in the context, remembering that this building is effectively 3 blocks from City Hall and 3 blocks from Main Street. It's a catty corner to the library. There's the skate park, there's the playground. The fire station is across the street, which probably has helped it from time to time, but it is part of downtown Texarkana. And so one of the things that we use as sort of a slogan for Texas Main Street is sort of imagine the possibilities. And what I'm going to walk you through here very quickly, and certainly if there's questions about this, we can circle back to it. But and you see the names of Gabe and William there, and Alan as well, who helped with this study over the past few months. So in sort of summarizing, and then I'll kind of go into these in a little bit more detail, there's different aspects. Preservation and construction, in even new construction, doesn't happen overnight. And a rehabilitation project or a preservation project, as this would be, is really important to think about the steps of what you have to do now, and then what you can do and plan for in the future. So from a Main Street perspective, one of the things that we're very interested in is the economic vitality of place. And so we want to see these buildings in use. But at the same time, because of the important heritage and community history of this place, it's really important to think about who was there, why it was built, what the story of that is, and how that maybe can inform what it needs to be in the future. So that's where some of these respect and creating a realistic plan, re-engaging with the African American community in Texarkana, I think is really, really important, so that they know what the history of this building is, that they maybe have passed and don't really recognize. And then so raising its profile, all of those things are really, really important. You see some proposed sketches here, and you'll see those detailed in a moment. So we created basically 3 quick scenarios, and these are sort of based on the economic research that Alan had done with the scholars, as well as sort of an initial assessment, preservation assessment of the building itself. One of the things as an architect and as a designer, it's kind of realizing the aspects of what you see. I mean, the building is remarkably in good condition, even though it's not currently occupied, and there are aspects of it that have deteriorated over time. And yes, it does need to have rehabilitation work. The building itself, the fabric, the historic fabric, the things that you can see are still there. And I think that that's really important, because once those things are removed, they're gone. Like, that history is just gone. And that's the thing that a lot of folks don't necessarily realize when they're kind of creating new uses for these buildings. So the first concept is really kind of turning it back into what it was. A mixed retail and office building. You hear that terminology today for new developments in town, in and around wherever you're from, and that's what this building was. The uniqueness of it was that it was 1929, and 3 Black professionals decided that they were going to buy a really prominent downtown site, and then hire the most famous firm in town, and then turn to their own community and give them the opportunity to construct it, and then for the community to use it for such a long time. And Cylestine talked about all the different businesses that were there. I think that that's really important to kind of consider. And so how do those businesses in your community maybe relocate to this, or maybe it's an entrepreneurial or a pop-up shop, and those are things that are realistic retail opportunities and office considerations. Again, the second floor, you have a wonderful museum system in Texarkana, but some of it is also sort of directing it to new resources. So if that auditorium exists, why couldn't this talk in a few years from now happen in that auditorium? It would be a perfect location for it. So here's a sketch of one of those spaces. The tin ceiling is very noticeable, but a coffee shop, a sandwich shop, the building was originally laid out with lease spaces, as Cylestine talked about, and you saw in the actual Sanborn map, the demising walls. So it, each one of these spaces could be a unique opportunity. Scenario 2 is sort of the nonprofit community in Texarkana. One of the things that we learned in sort of talking to Ina and others was that there was some opportunities for anchors. The Third Place, a barbershop, in the community. Those opportunities for financial literacy, job training, all the nonprofits that are within your community that might be in disparate parts of downtown or even on the outskirts. What if they were in a hub situation and were able to share resources? And so there's a consolidation that sort of starts to move this thing forward in a different kind of way. The proximity to the library is sort of, is indicative of this, and the fact that in the history of this, it was one of the original Black libraries in Texarkana. Again, talking about the second floor, there's maybe some office space for some of those nonprofits. And you see this was the anchor space on the end, which was the pharmacy. It's one of the largest of the tenant spaces, but you could imagine that it too, as an anchor, could really be really important, from a community standpoint. And scenario 3 is downtown higher education center. I think that Texas A&M-Texarkana, could really benefit from a downtown storefront on Main Street kind of idea. And one of the things here is that, we pushed it to the extreme in each one of these scenarios, kind of trying to stay to the concept. But I think that, as you all probably could think creatively, is that you could blend these concepts very, very easily because you have a building that exists. And so that scenario 1, 2, and 3 could all be complementary of one another, and that was intentional as well. But if it was only the first floor, that former pharmacy could be, why couldn't that? It's a historic pharmacy space. Why couldn't it be a place for pharmacy technicians, to utilize in the community? Have it downtown. Remember, this is walkable to City Hall. This is not that far. There's not a whole lot in between there right now, but when you activate this building, are you then activating the blocks in between it? The History Center, the history department that we're speaking to today. What a wonderful opportunity, even if it's just one of those tenant spaces to activate. Incubator spaces for the College of Business. There's a logic there as well. Behavioral science, child development. There's, as we've seen through the pandemic, all programming has changed and everybody has to consider things, work-life balance, all of those things, especially with the university center. There's some opportunities there as well. And then now the auditorium now becomes maybe that meeting space and event space. And then maybe it's also sort of a connected to that museum concept that we talked about earlier. So I'm going to close just the sketch image of the building with the street a little bit more activated. But I just sort of wanted to thank everybody for kind of listening to and thinking about this. It's an ongoing project, and the family has been really generous with us, as well as Ina with Texarkana Main Street. So thank you, and I guess we can open up to questions, Craig.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Thank you to all of our speakers, certainly Cylestine, Jamie, Ina. Folks can, make their applause however they wish, as we do on Zoom now, but we do have time for questions. So you can either type them into the chat box, or you can unmute yourself and basically just go ahead and ask. We've got a good, 10 solid minutes. We can go a little bit over if we have to. So
Craig,
yeah.
One thing I just wanted to mention that also makes this such a good project, the timing of it. What's happening in our downtown right now is tremendous. There are some major projects that are going on with the improvements being done at the courthouse, with what's going on at the Hotel Grimm. Now we're seeing the work at the Texarkana National Bank building. These are major projects just within a few blocks of the Jamison Building. And I'm sure most everyone is aware, it is just right across the street from our city library, which is certainly an important landmark and anchor in our downtown, as well as Kidtopia Park, the skate park that's there. So this building, it just seems like it's a perfect time for us to really complete the picture of all the things that we're seeing going on in our downtown right now.
And I'd say even along those lines, Ina, with this sketch being on the screen as you're talking about connecting it to the tissue of downtown, is that 3rd Street itself is an extra wide street. And what's sort of been, became very apparent to us with this building is there's a parking lot right behind this building that's quite large and underutilized. And then the street itself out in front, there's an opportunity for a parklet. So if you've been and seen those kind of popping up, especially during the pandemic, where people are trying to activate, underutilized parking spaces or areas in front of businesses, this location in front of this building would be a perfect location, especially to augment whatever's going on inside. And so I think there's and what that does is obviously sort of connects it back into downtown even more and some of the other developments that are going on.
Yes, and the street right in front of the Jamison Building was just in the last couple of years turned into two-way streets. It was a one-way. So now that it's two-way, it certainly makes it more accessible.
And if I may say, as has been spoken, this building is irreplaceable. It still exists. It really would not serve us well if we were to allow it to be lost. Every person who has had an experience in the Jamison Building has a story to tell. Everyone who hears about stories about the Jamison Building has stories to tell. So all of those stories put together along with the other stories in Texarkana, Arkansas, help to make the story of Texarkana, Texas and Arkansas complete.
Absolutely. Any questions from the audience? Anyone want to jump in? Don't be shy.
I think we had one person ask if the building was open for tours. And I believe Ramon said that tours could be scheduled. It is not open on a regular basis, of course, but it sounds like the family would be willing to allow some tours that were pre-scheduled.
Yes, and good afternoon to everyone. This is Ramon. I am the son of Cylestine. And so, yes, we would love the opportunity to give anyone that's interested in taking a look or walking through the Jamison Building that opportunity. As my mom stated, when you do walk through the building, it's like walking back in time to the early 1900s. And so there's a lot of history. The architecture of the building is very unique. And you just get a sense of, what type of, what was the environment back then? And you just get a feeling in your bones of what this building meant to a lot of people back then. So with that being said, if there's anyone that is interested, we would definitely love that opportunity to share this experience with you.
And I'll just sort of add to that as well is that, one of the things that when folks, as an architect and a preservationist, I mean, I've done a lot of new construction in my career as well. If you think about a series of tenant spaces in a retail environment where each of them has a party wall, that's what this building was doing in the 20s and 30s. That's how it was created on the street front. So in this image that you see on the screen, each one of those glass sections that's shown, and then you have sort of the unique entry for the pharmacy there on the corner, is each one of those is an individual space. It has an entry on the front for the public, and it has a door on the back, for the employees to take in deliveries or work on supplies or something like that. And so they're, kind of linear spaces that are really very, very similar to the way that our retail spaces are laid out today. The building's a little bit smaller and maybe in terms of the footprint of some of those spaces that you see today, but the layout and the architecture is something that can be used, creatively. And I think as Ramon and Cylestine have said, is that it is like walking back in time. Especially on the upstairs. And then when you kind of look through some of the details and see them, the historic fabric is really present in the building, and it's wonderful that you have this asset. It's just now time for it to have a new life.
Absolutely.
I thought we might also mention that just recently a grant was written with the help of Jamie, Main Street, Texas, and Alan and A&M, and of course the family, that was written to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And we have not heard back, but that's a start of our efforts to try to revitalize and get this building active again. So we're fingers crossed that we hear something positive on that.
Yeah, amen.
I have a question.
Sure.
As a citizen of Texarkana, what can I do or what can we do to assist in this project in preserving the building, rehabbing the, what can we do as citizens of Texarkana to assist?
Great question. Yeah. Who wants to handle that one?
If I may jump in. So I think the great question, first of all, I think the first thing that you can do, or anyone that can do, is spread the word. I think word of mouth is very important. I think creating the more awareness that we can create around this building and the project and the work that we're looking to start, I think we will attract more resources. And also, I think the second thing that you can do as a citizen, if you do have any stories, or if you do know anyone who has stories of the Jamison Building, we would love to capture those stories and try to create a repository of information for anyone that experienced the Jamison Building personally or knows anyone. So there's a couple of things that I think you or anyone that can really get engaged and help us with as we continue to move forward with the project. But great question.
I would just add too, is that I think from, as a citizen of Texarkana, is that I think that you have, as you saw in the three scenarios that are kind of outlined, a blending of those three things really involves a lot of community input. I think the family has really showed a very strong interest in the history, both of the building, but also the community. And a real desire to kind of connect with the community, whether it be the university community or the community at large. And I think that even Cylestine, when we first met on site, she shared with me that, just as Ramon was saying, is they would love to have an exhibit space within the building to share some of these, to share this history. And I think that that's something that we see in a lot of Main Street communities and historic properties that get redeveloped. But I think that, the beauty of it is that you have a wonderful building. You have a great asset that's, that still has a lot of its historic fabric that's really, really important. It just needs the word of mouth. It needs the kind of creative connections to capital, as well as interest, and then even some governmental interest probably as well.
Yeah, for our purposes in the department and in the Red River Center for Regional History and Culture, I'll make the link to this talk certainly freely available on YouTube, and folks can disseminate it. We're also, advocating as much as we can in the university to try to invest in some resources to build that kind of connection with places specifically like the Jamison. So, but yeah, the more citizen pressure that can be brought to bear on anyone in the community who has influence and or money is always a good idea. So, but I mean, in all seriousness, that's essentially what we can do. And so, any other last questions before we run up against 1 o'clock here? Okay, well, let's go ahead and thank our presenters once again. Thank you very much, Cylestine, Jamie, Ina, Ramon. If anything does come up in the, after this, you're welcome to email me at history@tamut.edu, and I can direct your inquiry to whoever. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. Yeah, appreciate it.
Thank you.